Both sides are preparing to deliver closing statements tomorrow in the trial of William Czaplinski. Today, prosecutors called 5 witnesses to the stand, entering into evidence body cam footage from the hospital that was captured on the night of the crash, along with a drone rendering of the scene and also blood alcohol levels. As KLTV7's Lauren Tier reports, at the time the blood was drawn, about 1 hour after the crash happened, Czaplinski was above the legal limit.
It's not a DUI, it's an intoxication manslaughter.
Oh my gosh. I didn't kill him. You killed yourself.
To start day 2, the jury was shown body camera footage from the night of the crash at the hospital, where Czaplinski's blood was taken for lab testing. Czaplinski initially refused to do the blood test, so DPS trooper Charles Pryor had to get a warrant signed by Judge Taylor Heaton. On the body cam, Czaplinski questions the legitimacy of the judge's signature, but the nurse takes the blood as soon as the warrant is signed. After saying he didn't drink any alcohol before driving, Czaplinski said this in the hospital. The next witness was on the crash investigation team responsible for recreating what happened after collision using gouge marks on the road and drone photos. The photos come together to make this map. In cross-examination, the defense noted the rendering only looks at the point of contact and what happened after.
It doesn't tell us who did what prior to that collision, does it?
No, sir.
It really doesn't tell us who hit who, does it?
Well, they hit each other.
A forensic scientist verified the results of Czaplinski's blood alcohol test, showing his BAC was about 0.124.
At that level, your, as I said, judgment, reasoning, your attention is slower, your reaction times are slower. You would also start to see some actual physical effects,
including reduced sensory abilities like hearing and vision. She then testified those things should not be impaired to safely drive. Finally, the state called the victim's wife, Kelly Collins. She testified she was notified by a location tracking app that her husband's phone had been thrown and that his car was in a ditch on the night of September 8th, 2023. Collins was on his way that night to Winona High School to pick up his son after an away football game.
On the border that night, did Harry have any alcohol to drink?
No.
She testified her husband only drank alcohol, quote, once or twice a year. Lauren Tier, KLTV 7 News.
Both sides are expected to deliver closing arguments tomorrow, allowing the jury to begin deliberating.